This is the 18th edition of the Idea of Iran, a long series of symposium made possible thanks to the generosity of the Sudavar Memorial Foundation. And I'm very happy to welcome here today some of the trustees of the foundation. And I'm also very happy to see Dr. Sarah Stewart, emeritus reader at SOAS, who initiated this series a few years ago. I would like to extend a special thanks to Fatima Sudavar for her precious advice in the realization of this event. And I would like also to express my gratitude to SOAS professional service team, to our student ambassadors who are helping today, to Peshban, Akbarzadeh, Akhil Borzi, and especially to Imogen Edwards, who overviewed every aspect of this symposium. It is for me really a great honor to co-convene this symposium with Charles Melville, emeritus professor of Persian history at Cambridge University, founder of the Pembroke Shahnameh Center for Persian Studies, and editor of public proceedings of the Idea of Iran series. And I must say that as a student, I was greatly inspired by Charles in the occasion of events in Cambridge and St. Andrews. Well, that's all from my side. I wish you to enjoy this wonderful lineup of speakers that we have for today and tomorrow. And on that note, I would like to hand over to Sadi Sudavar, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you. I wanted, on behalf of the Sudavar Memorial Foundation, to quickly pay tribute to Iraj Baghezadeh. Many of you will have known him. Since our last gathering for this Idea of Iran series, he passed away last year. He was often amongst us over the years, and I want to pay tribute to his legacy to Middle Eastern studies. Iraj's legacy was immense as the founder and publisher of IB Tauris. IB Tauris was named after the ancient name of his hometown of Tabriz. And on his passing, he left a legacy of over 4,000 titles. He founded the publisher to fill a gap in the West, focused, as he thought, on Greco-Roman and European civilization, to cover Middle East studies, Iranian studies, the history of Central Asia and Islamic art and architecture. And that legacy is quite a profound one. And we were very honored at the Sudavar Memorial Foundation to work with him at IB Tauris, now part of Bloomsbury, in publishing these series. You'll see in the program that they're available to purchase in terms of the back catalog, the last one being The Contest for Rule in 18th Century Iran, and we hope soon to see this one in publication as well. With that, I'll hand over to Charles. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariano and Salman. Also, of course, my pleasant job is to thank everybody who has already been thanked, so it's very repetitive. But I'd just like to thank Mariano for sort of picking up the baton so smoothly from Sarah and carrying on as though there'd been no change, with Sarah, I'm sure, helping in the background. So it's great to be able to keep the series going at SOAS. I'd also obviously like to thank Fatima and Leila, who, of course, know much more about the Qajar period than anybody else, because they're sort of inhabitants of it. And so drawing up the programme has been very much a sort of joint effort, with me proposing some things and Fatima and Leila proposing many others, and coming up with a gorgeous, I hope, compromise. So thank you for that, and just to register sadness that Leila can't be with us because she had a bad fall and is unable to travel, so she'll be making her presentation online. Just briefly about the conference, of course, there's so much one could say about the Qajars. We could have a whole week, really, and not cover everything. But I think it's important to remember that the idea of the series isn't just to have a conference about the Qajars. It's about the idea of Iran, and that means, and the whole series is to think about how the idea of Iran was formed in the different periods that we've been covering from the first antiquity up till the late 19th century. And probably the Qajar era is when this idea of Iran, or a modern idea of Iran, really began to be formed, not only, I would say, in the West, but probably also in Iran itself, through the exposure to other countries and the real lived experience of visiting each other's countries. I mean, the Iranians to Europe, the Europeans to Iran, and all the consequences for that, both politically and socially and economically. But of course, while all that was going on, what you might call the history, people were forming an idea of the people they were working with, the country they were visiting, and the views they had, of course, becoming increasingly prolifically expressed. And so really, with that in mind, we've got a programme for the next couple of days devoted, I hope, to putting the historical and economic and social context, of course, in the back of our minds, but just thinking about how we all formed an idea of Iran in that period and the sources for that idea, and also how the Iranians in a way discovered themselves, if that doesn't sound too patronising. It's not supposed to be. I mean, it was becoming aware, in other words, of their place in the world and relationship with neighbouring countries and neighbouring peoples. So I think we don't really need to go on. That clock is apparently 10 to 4. It's like the clock in Grantchester, where it's stuck on 10 to 3. So anyone casually glancing up there to see if they're running over time will be disappointed, because there's that famous story about someone giving a speech and listening to his watch and saying, I can't believe it. It's still only that, and then realising the watch had stopped. But anyway, so there we are. So I'd like to get going, because I think we've already started a tiny bit late, and invite our first panel, and please enjoy the conference and participate with your questions and discussion, and I hope we'll have a very fruitful couple of days. Thank you very much.
I am Negar Habibi, and I'm a lecturer of the arts of Iran and Islam at the University of Geneva, and I'm so honored to start our two-day symposium by this fascinating panel, which is about the discovery of ancient Iran and its treasures, with two speakers. So our first speaker is Dr. Lindsay Allen, a senior lecturer in ancient history in the Department of Classics, King's College, London. She has published on the extraction of antiquities from Iran in the early 19th and 20th centuries, and her today's talk is titled Material Culture and the Construction of Iranian Antiquity. Please join me in welcoming her.
This is an exploration of the way in which we talk about antiquity or ancient remains, most particularly Persepolis, as a foundational element of Iranian national identity in the modern period. And I'm going to start with some observations on my background. I'm then going to talk about recent narratives of the role of antiquity in Iranian nationhood in academia, and then I'm going to follow an idiosyncratic trail through some evidence in order to look at the multiple voices, the multiple narratives of antiquity that use depictions or inspirations of material culture through the 19th century and into the 20th. So to start with, this is my background. I have come from an ancient studies context, looking particularly at the history of antiquities and the survival of material culture from antiquity and how it's interpreted. My initial publications on the 19th century dealt with really the English language side of this study, with the East India Company's, British East India Company's involvement overland in progressive, let's say, depredations, particularly at the site of Persepolis Takht-i Jamshid in Iran. And that is publication from over 10 years ago now. With funding from the Iran Heritage Foundation and from the Sudafar Memorial Foundation, I visited a number of archives in order to trace the histories of 19th century fragments from Persepolis. This is a diaspora, though, that really started in the 18th century, and I'll make a couple of kind of references back to the 18th century as a relevant starting point in other respects. The image that you see on the far left is actually from De Bruyn, an early 18th century traveller who himself brought elements, pieces, back from Iran in order to support the accuracy of his drawings that he then published, according to his own account. On the left, just to its right, you see another piece that James Justinian Morier brought back, and it's still missing, so if anybody's seen it, let me know. As part of his own role as a secretary in the British Embassy of Sir Ouseley in 1811. So that's my sort of initial English language background. From that point in the early 19th century, where we have effectively a British political spoliation of the site, the progressive revelation, really, of material antiquity in the 19th century is interpreted as a progressive narrative, normally, as a narrative that builds accuracies upon accuracies upon accuracies and reveals more and more about those realities. And I'm not completely disagreeing with this way of talking about first of all, the drawings of sites, then photography of sites, then the better photography of sites, and then an increased degree of detail in surveying of them. But I do want to sort of critique that a little bit and to ask how we can tell that narrative. From a recent article by Christopher Etty, I'm actually writing about one of the most important Persian language publications on antiquity of the 19th century, Fursat al-Shirazi, on the remains of Iran, the ruins of Fars. She comments, the rediscovery of the Achaemenid past, which is to some extent essential to the birth of the modern national idea of Iran, is part of his legacy. Also, more recently in 2021, there is the sort of overall linking of the clarification of material antiquity, let's say, to political eras within the Iranian state. She comments, Safavid collapse led Persianate scholars and artists to grapple with new conceptions of universal history by re-evaluating the place of Iran in that universe during the turbulent long 19th century. Gradually but surely, she says, Iran's antiquities were recast according to the terms of the present. So there's quite a lot of discussion of the recovery of knowledge, the uncovering of knowledge, as a conversation with challenges from European historians and from larger narratives of history, which I would like to emphasize is not completely wrong. However, I do think there's also regional histories and community histories to be uncovered here. Just to start with, I want to sum up what I think is part of Grigor's argument underpinning the statement, the second statement. And I'm going to just sort of complicate that slightly as a lead-in to my own narrative. And I want to emphasize, I think this is a wonderful book, this recent book, The Persian Revival, which was desperately needed and gives a really fantastic introduction to the evolution of a sort of Persianate idiom in modern architecture through the 19th and 20th centuries in Iran and India. As a sort of backstory to this influence, to this movement, Grigor cites a start in the 18th century, specifically with the translation of the Avesta and of other associated texts. That these texts influenced European theories of linguistic, religious and racial, notably diffusionism, with a growing emphasis on that racial element as the century went on. She also cites the sort of axis of transport and relationships between individuals connected by that transport of Britain in India, i.e. the governorship of Bengal, the Persian Gulf, the Persianized, as it were, East India Company. These are individuals who are really staffing the government in India, but are detached from that and rather more, like Sir John Malcolm, the Ousleys and others, rather more semi-detached from that and used as post holders who liaise with the Iranian elite via the Persian Gulf. I'm going to come back to my NB there later. She notes that following this East India Company involvement, there is a rise in European travel narratives, which is true. There's a greater proliferation of print records of Iran, and that's something we'll think more about as the conference goes on. And she also notes the increasing complexity of reconstructions and documentations, first in architectural drawings and then in photographs, as something which represents a European search for a new or more specific and racialized form of architecture in Iran. And I'm just going to sort of leave that point aside because I think it's a really interesting one that is more to do with her thesis for the rest of the book than mine today. So my complications of this progression of her thought include a sort of additional historical context on the academic side. So I want to point out that not just the Avesta is being translated in the 19th century and therefore made available more widely via intermediaries with European language speakers, but that is an essential part of the process of the decipherment of Old Persian cuneiform, which is done remotely in Europe, in Groningen, via copies of short inscriptions from Persepolis specifically. This is a process that's often linked with Bizertun and with Rawlinson, but in fact it starts at Persepolis in the late 18th and early 19th century. This knowledge is not taken up systematically until the 18 teens a little bit, and then the 1830s, when it is used by scholars such as Rawlinson to start unlocking other ancient languages written in cuneiform languages. And this is where I have my NB. Beware assumptions behind these European visitors having classical schooling exclusively. John Malcolm and Porter, Robert Kerr Porter, who may be well known to some of you as an artist who visited Iran in the 18 teens, they did not really have a secondary school education. And Malcolm in particular learned Persian, as it were, before he probably learned any Greek. William Ousley, who was a kind of the voice of knowledge, the voice of scholarship within the Sagor Ousley, his brother's diplomatic mission. He was a Persianist, and Robert Gordon, his fellow diplomat, commented that he was not a Grecian, he didn't have Greek. So all of these individuals are actually trying to access the Persian knowledge that they're encountering as they visit Iran. And that knowledge, that discussion, does contribute to the later decipherment of other cuneiform languages, Akkadian, and then later Sumerian and Elamite. In the 1840s, I also want to note that the rediscovery of ruins in Mesopotamia, in Ottoman Mesopotamia, means that the focus shifts away to a certain extent from Persepolis and Takhti Jamshid, from the feeling that Persianate texts would give Europeans knowledge of antiquity. That's much more of an 18th century vibe than a mid-19th century vibe. At the same time, despite that kind of, oh, there's not quite as much information there that we thought, feeling that is beginning to emerge in academic discussion, the access to Iran overland vastly increased, so that it becomes more of a recreational destination, often by military officers, and steam, direct government via military detachments in India, access via the Suez Canal, and then later on the sort of institution of telegraph links between Europe and India mean that there's a great more facilitation of access to archaeological remains in Iran by multiple different groups, including Europeans. So to sort of sum up, to kind of complicate what Grevor is proposing, those excavations of the mid-19th century actually decenter Iran and Persianate narratives on antiquity, and really make it much more of a niche occupation within ancient studies and archaeological studies, because the Assyrian remains at their kind of scale kind of reveals more material, effectively, much more monumental material to be spoliated, to be extracted and taken to Europe. At the same time, there is a sort of ongoing investment in the documentation of antiquity in Iran, and I want to note that quite a lot of the evidence that we have for detailed documentation from the middle of the 19th century onwards is internally sponsored, is effectively Iran supported. This is a quotation from Grigor noting that the photographer Luigi Pesce gifted the king an album of photographs from Persepolis. Nasruddin Shah being more excited about them being photographs is perhaps understandable if you know his penchant for photography, but I do want to kind of caution against this decentering of the ruins of antiquity in the royal Iranian gaze, as it were, here. I want to sort of, again, problematize that. It's not that necessarily antiquity is being lost sight of. This is a sort of joint enterprise. I also want to note that there's something else going on when Pesce photographs Persepolis and then gifts these photographs to the Shah. He is employed within the Dar al-Funun, the sort of new technical college founded in Tehran in order to support industrial and intellectual development in the new capital. And he and his colleague seem to have visited Persepolis together. And I can tell you that because his colleague was August Kurtzich, who is famous also for producing an early map of Tehran. And I can tell you for certain that they visited there together, seemingly because Kurtzich walked off with a couple of pieces from the north facade of the Apadana. On the left, a piece in St. Petersburg in the Hermitage, and on the right, a piece in Vienna. The one on the left is sometimes attributed to Kerporter. It's not, it's Kurtzich. They were taken out circa 1858. They immediately found their way to European collections, and their origins were more or less forgotten, I would say. But they were undertaken by employees of the Shah in their kind of, as it were, technical studies of the site. I would like to emphasise, I suspect this wasn't authorised. I strongly suspect this wasn't authorised. And just to give you an image here, this is from the 1870s, a photographic survey of the site showing you the hole that the Kurtzich piece in Vienna was taken from. So talking about depredations and vulnerabilities of remains, I want to kind of take us back to the embassy of 1811, where we have Sagor Uzli being recorded in the Faznameh Naseri by Hassan Fasai as appearing in Iran, in Persia, as the ambassador to the Shah. I bring this up because this kind of brings up a number of different themes in how we find archaeological remains, material culture, being talked about in 19th century sources and even into the early 20th century. I wanted to kind of emphasise here that this 1811 entry in the Faznameh is exclusively about Sagor Uzli in Iran and his career and how lovely it was and how amazingly well it went. And then a tomb find in the northwest of the country, and then something else happening in Fars. So here is the account of a Mongol tomb being allegedly discovered underground in a mountain in Nin Sultaniye. I've put to the right one of the very large pieces taken away from Persepolis by Uzli's expedition. None of that is mentioned in this history, and I just want to note that as well. So as the tomb discovery narrative goes on, the local governor of the region finds out about the initial plunder of this site, and he recovers on his own account a number of exotic items, and I include an Edmund Dulac image of Aladdin's cave because it seems to be taking that vibe. So Abdullah Mirza recovers a tuft of feathers of strange make to which fragments of rubies, emeralds and turquoises were attached, a girdle adorned in the same manner, a dagger with a gilt handle and sheath, some other objects of gold, which might have been horse ornaments, a square bottle full of gold studded with jewels and full of water, a goblet of gold studded with rubies and emeralds. And these he sent back to the Shah, which is him being a very good boy, being a very good governor. Still, in 1811, the entry continues. All was brought to Tehran, handed over to the Shah and put in the treasury. In response, when this became known in Fars, Hossein Ali Mirza Farmer gave orders to pierce the lids, sorry about the typo, of the stone coffins of the Khayanids, i.e. the Achaemenid tombs over in the mountain above Persepolis, Takhti Jamshid. It says at Takhti Jamshid in the district of Mavdash, so that a man might enter, i.e. go in and poke around. They did not find anything except a handful of fine dusts of the bodies of Jamshid, Qaboos and Qajar. Now, how you take this anecdote is up for debate. I'm rather suspicious that this is a slightly undermining narrative to give to the governor of Fars for this era, that he was trying to have as good a find as another governor that he could send to the Shah, but he failed and he found the, sort of the dust of disappeared kings. It doesn't seem to have any repercussions from him at that point. He is reported elsewhere in the Farsnameh as infringing various other sort of sacred precincts, but within this entry for 1811, it's all about just the Shah's rearrangement of the offices of Fars, so the kind of the reorganisation of administration in that province. I wanted to sort of jump though from Farmer's escapade at the tombs by noting that he's not the only person defiling tombs in Persepolis in the early 19th century. If we do want to see somebody with a classical background who is travelling for leisure in Iran, we have an early example of that in the shape of Robert Wilson of Aberdeen, who took some antiquities back to Aberdeen as part of his finds. You see a very typical image of him in Ottoman garb. He brought this costume back too on the Acropolis. He reports that he is sort of then processing the information from this cuneiform decipherment of the early 19th century, which is what he's noting here, deciphering which Professor Grotefund has done much. He's talking to Claudius James Rich, who is the East India Company resident in Baghdad. So there are these translations are circulating amongst this personnel. However, the translations that are circulating amongst these personnel mention Jamshid. Now, Jamshid is not in the trilingual inscriptions, Achaemenid inscriptions of Persepolis, but what has happened here is that Rich, Keir Porter and others have all re-added Jamshid to their interpretations of some of the cuneiform inscriptions at Persepolis. So this is an instinct that's not exclusive to the Qajar elite. This is something shared amongst the Europeans who explore these sites. Whilst he's there, Wilson also excavates on the terrace and he clears the earth in front of the tombs, again the ones that are reported as having been opened in 1811. He says he found little worthy of my toil. He did take the arrowheads home. I was unable to resist the temptation, he says, of seeing the contents of the sarcophagi inside the tombs. Therefore, he determined to blow it up with gunpowder. A sacrilege which cost me a pang, which is a phrase that, yes, is remarkable, and will be a source of regret to future travellers as the top is now rent in twain. And this is true, that one of the sarcophagi has a broken top in the Takhti Jamshid tombs. And this key word of sacrilege is something I want to pick up on then to sort of talk about other responses to investigations of the ruins in the early 19th century. So just bear with me on this. One finds this in numerous different mentions of individuals digging at Persepolis. And the kinds of narratives that are being reported are rather similar to that combination of elements in the Farsnameh of there being possible treasure, but also sacrilege of infringing on this ancient territory. So, for example, Richard Strachey writing a manuscript letter to his father in 1803 about excavations with the diplomatic embassy of Sir John Malcolm in 1800, saying that a report had reached Isfahan before us that we had discovered an immense treasure by digging at Persepolis. Yes and no. In fact, he had taken this fragment away. This is now in Minneapolis, actually. And this was the first piece from the site that we know of to have reached England. But this combination of the greed of foreigners, the possible greed of anybody trying to impinge on ancient sites, plus a sort of responsibility that local people felt about the site continues. So, for example, in the 18 teens, Robert Keir Porter, visiting the site, says, a man of the village had lately thrown down a pillar on the Great Terrace and died the following day. Nothing of the kind was likely to happen again, the danger of such sacrilege, that word again, being now perfectly understood. So many dreams had foreshown his fate from Solomon or the devil that no man henceforward would dare put a finger on the fabrics. This idea that you can actually have a sort of slightly supernatural encounter with the ruins continues in other sources. For example, again, another embassy visiting in 1827, here the report that there is a beetle that has this year proved very destructive to the crops in the plain, and the ignorant peasants said that it was occasioned by the Europeans having broken a talisman which existed amongst the ruins of Persepolis and which used to preserve the grain from injury. Colonel Stannis, who was the resident at Bushire for the East India Company, the year before disinterred a number of sculpted stones, capitals of columns, and a flight of locusts appeared. And the peasants immediately set to work to carefully cover up what Stannis had taken so much pains to reveal. And Alexander is pretty unsympathetic and scathing about this. This is actually, though, a serious point to kind of make about the communal ownership and protection of such ruins. This word talisman, again, like sacrilege, is an important keyword. Elsewhere, leaving Tabriz on the way home, Alexander and his party experience being given a talisman. This is a piece of paper in this case, being inscribed with sundry strange characters and devices. This is an object of protection for them. This is where I would need Matt Melvin Kushki to be here to explain it, as in his own paper, the relevance of talismanic thought to statecraft in the early modern period, in which talismanic science effectively is seen as part of state political science and skills that protect the king, protect the court, protect the realm. So I would suggest to you that this talismanic thought, which is dismissed by our European travellers, shows that relics, sites, antiquities have all actually had an association as important protective elements of the country, of the terrain, for many centuries. This is a point that comes up as part of an argument that Moy Carey and I made a couple of years ago now, that Persepolis itself had an important status within the new Safavid kind of regime, let's call it, of Shah Abbas, after his refoundation of his capital in Isfahan, and then the retaking of Ormuzd in the Persian Gulf as part of his assertion of control of the province of Fars. I wanted to note then that these stories of damage which result from bad governing is something that predates the identification of this site as Persepolis itself. So this idea that international esteem of Persepolis as a site that is connected with world history is the only thing that prompts people to value it, is one that we should set aside, because what we find here is this is Chilmenar, a site being visited in the early 17th century with the governor of Fars by this ambassador de Gouveia, and there is already a story about governing protection of the site versus local ruination. At the same time, that same governor of Fars, Imam Qoli Khan, is later alleged to be himself destructive or possibly greedy in his infringement of the site, and this is again back in the 17th century. According to Chardin, writing rather later in the 1670s, 1680s, Imam Qoli Khan visited Persepolis with a European who translated for him 2 lines of cuneiform. Of course, 200 years before this was actually done, so just to be clear. Imam Quli Khan struck a stone lion's head with his scimitar, causing the ground to open and pour forth gold and silver that he loaded upon 60 camels to bear back to the king. So this is starting to ring a bell with our farmer and farmer narrative about the tombs earlier on, that a governor should protect his province and should protect the important kind of cultural treasures of his province, and if he doesn't, it might be due to greed or competition or rivalry with others and so on. And I just wanted to add on to this a couple of points about the ways in which it's important that we see a lot of the Qajar neo-Achaemenidisms, as I call them, that is, emulations of Achaemenid motifs in the late 19th century, as part of this governance narrative of different groups all claiming different, as it were, sorts of protection over the province of Fars. So after a period of instability again in the Farsnameh, this account suggests that the Shah put up his quarters in the Bagha Nur, and that is a garden of the farmers, presented the Shah with the sum of 200,000 tuman in cash, i.e. doing the right thing, giving the Shah all his money and his treasures. And during his 4-day stay in that garden outside the city of Shiraz, the Shah dispatched detachments of horse and foot belonging to his escort to the southern districts of Fars. So he's kind of asserting his control over the whole area. Then he entered Shiraz in the splendour of Jamshid again, with the revenue of Qajar, and established himself in the Vakili Palace. And I wanted to add here, and I think this has been pointed out by numerous other people, that the Zand throne from the previous, as it were, capital use of Shiraz, this shifting of government to Shiraz under the Zand dynasty, itself alludes to the iconography of Persepolis, with the throne being borne on the shoulders of followers, supporters, and so on. So there is a direct relevance of the visible at this point. The visible remains at Persepolis, showing a Persian king being born on the shoulders of others, to the way power was being constructed in Shiraz in the late 18th century, which is then taken over by the Qajar king as part of his own building of his legitimacy. So it's not completely new, and I just wanted to give a shout out to the fact that we have an early image located by Moya Carey of these throne supporters appearing in an image of Qajar, actually, in an illustrated copy of the Shahnameh from the early 17th century, now in Berlin. And we think in this case we want to propose that this figure here is quite possibly the governor of Fars. So what we have is repeated uses of this motif, this imagery, this setting of Persepolis to show loyalty to the king, support of the king. And I don't have time to talk more about this now, but I wanted to note that our examples of Qajar rock reliefs across the country of Iran possibly include at least one from the local ruling family in Fars, as well as Fath Ali Shah, for example, across the rest of the country. So we have a use of a sort of antique idiom to express this relationship, this governing of Fars. I'm going to just point out that where we find motifs of this neo-Achaemenid enthronement in the rest of sort of increasing, proliferating imagery of antiquity in Qajar, Iran, we find it being used for Jamshid, most particularly. And I want to refer you to a really wonderful article by Farshid Imami in Roxburgh and Williams's Technologies of the Image from a few years ago now for more detail on that. But these examples then become incredibly influential. At the same time, the security, the preservation, the conservation of the site itself is again being taken over by a succession of governors of Fars. In this case, from an inscription in the Palace of Darius by Farhad Mirza, and this is just to summarise, again, another period of unrest in the 1870s this time. There is a putting down of rebellion, there is an execution in Shiraz, although I do want to note that in the 1860s, a rebel was particularly executed at Persepolis, according to the Farsname. So you could also display your executed rebels in Persepolis. And as part of that restoration of power, there is a clearing away of rubble in the site. This is reinforced in a second inscription, which talks about the obscurity that has been inflicted on the remains, which Fahad Mirza orders to be removed from the whole of the abode of Jamshid for the glory of his justice. These are part of the results of that project, which includes the photographic documentation of the site, again commissioned by the governor for publication later in Berlin in 1881, which preserves a valuable document of the state of the site. As also as part of that era, we have an increased investment in decorative art derived from that, but almost exclusively amongst ruling elites. And I'm going to skip over this because I have too much detail. I have another paper I can refer you to on the carpet commissions, which show a very precise effort to mirror again, very particularly this thing of the king being supported by his army, his ranks. And one should note that although this is glossed in multiple places as resulting from European influence, which is what these summaries are suggesting, I'll just flick through them, it's in fact really striking that the image is not from recent photography of the 1870s, but it is in fact from an image pirated from Robert Porter from the 18-teens and then reproduced in a popular publication of the 1840s. And this is just a way of showing you that progression. This is all a rather broader range of iconography than just the enthronement, but one notes the kind of recurrence of the enthronement as the thing being encountered in Persepolis and referred to throughout the mid-19th century. I want to note that this is then adopted by local elites, including the Qajar tribe, and possibly, and this is just a sort of thing putting out there as a kind of, okay, I thought I was going for 35, and that this is part of the kind of, let's say, local elite ambitions. So all of this new Achaemenidism is being sponsored and constructed within Shiraz and Fars. I'm missing out a episode of plunder, but I just wanted to note that even by the early 20th century, the narratives of plunder of the site via sort of secret investigations continue in a narrative encountered by a travelling soldier. And in this case, the narrative places the governor of Fars again as a sort of hero who is combating these contraventions of propriety. I'm going to end on a thing that takes us to Kalikian for the next paper, because I want to note that the person who was blamed, let's say, by Kalikian for taking some pieces out of Persepolis in the early 20th century was of the Khavami family, possibly as a sort of a versus, as a sort of competition element with Qashqai tribes. So instead of just thinking about nationalism and national narrative, I want to also note that the actual evidence that we have for reflection on material antiquity in the 19th century talks about care for it, protection, scrutiny, but also intrinsic qualities that are relevant to communities and to local provinces. Thank you.
This panel is entitled Foreign and Persian Perceptions of Iran. My name is Asif Ashraf. I am going to be chairing this panel. We have two speakers on this panel. Unfortunately, one of our speakers, David Mu'tadil, was unable to attend and to join us here in person, but he has
sent his lecture in to us by video. So I will introduce him and then turn it over to our projector, where, and hopefully we'll be able to hear his lecture on the talk then, and then I'll introduce our second speaker, Charles Melville, afterwards. But a few words about David Mortadel. David is Associate Professor of International History at the London School of Economics and Political Science here in London. He's the author of numerous books, including a history of Muslims under German rule in the Second World War, published in 2014, and the recipient of the Frankel Prize. He's also the editor or co-editor of 2 volumes, a volume on Islam and the European empires, published by Oxford University Press in 2014, and a just completed co-edited volume on unconquered states, non-European powers in the imperial age. He has also just completed, and I think it's going to be imminently published, a monograph on the Shah's Grand Tour, Global Monarchy in the Age of Empire, and his lecture today, which he has pre-recorded for us, is related to this monograph that he will be publishing. So let's turn it over to virtual David.
Hello, everyone. I'm sorry I can't be there in London today, but I'm grateful to the organizers for allowing me to present my paper here via Zoom. I will speak for about 20 minutes. In the summers of 1873, 1878, and 1889, the Persian monarch Nasruddin Shah embarked on 3 tours of Europe. He was the first Shah ever to visit the continent. He dined with the Tsars at the Winter Palace of St. Petersburg, enjoyed receptions given by Prince Leopold II in Brussels, and attended banquets with the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph at Schönbrunn Palace. On his first visit to Paris, an endless crowd lined his ceremonial progress along the Champs-Élysées. No less splendid were his receptions in Britain, where the Persians lodged at Buckingham Palace and exchanged orders with Queen Victoria at Windsor Castle. The Shah visited steel mills, attended the great naval reviews in the English Channel, enjoyed Madame Tussauds Wax Gallery and performances at the Royal Opera. In Berlin, he discussed world politics and grand strategy with Chancellor Bismarck, witnessed an assassination attempt on Wilhelm I, and attended military maneuvers with Wilhelm II. Some years later, the Shah's son and successor, Mosafar Shah, followed in his father's footsteps, and he too was received at all major European courts during 3 European tours in 1900, 1902, and 1905. The visits of the Shahs all became huge public events, attracting many thousands of onlookers onto the street. In London, Mark Twain, who in 1873 was commissioned by the New York Herald to write an entire article series on the Shah's stay in Britain, reported, I quote, "The streets for miles are crammed with people waiting whole long hours for a chance glimpse of the Shah. I've never seen any man draw like this one." End quote. And this Shahmania was reflected in newspaper articles and caricatures, in cheap books and novels, and even in theater and operetta. And yet the visits were spectacular, exotic events, not only in the eyes of the Europeans. To the Shahs, Europe appeared to be a remote, strange, and at times troubling place. They recorded their experience in detail in their travelogues, which today provide us with a fascinating historical source. Historians have overall given surprisingly little attention to the European tours of the Shahs. If considered at all, they have been routinely dismissed as devoid of any political significance, as nothing but, I quote, "costly and useless," as the Orientalist Edward G. Brown once characterized them. And yet the Shah's own accounts explicitly contradict this perception, both claiming actually that a major reason for visiting Europe was political interest. And while we should treat, of course, the Shah's statements with some caution, there is evidence that the visits did indeed have political implications. And this brings me to the bigger question in a way, because the Shah's tours can be seen as part of a much wider historical phenomenon, because royal visits of non-European monarchs to the centers of European power, the European capitals, became recurring events during the heyday of European imperialism. They all came. Ahmad Bey of Tunis in 1846, Sultan Abdulaziz in 1867, the King of Hawaii in 1881, the Queen of Hawaii, sister in 1887, Sultan Abu Bakr of Johor frequently actually died in London during his last day. The King of Siam in 1897 and 1907, various Japanese princes also came to Europe, and so on. So this is a major historical phenomenon, basically. And I've actually just finished a short book on those visits of non-European royalty to Europe in the era of high imperialism. It will come out in German this autumn, and there will be an English translation soon as well. In Europe, the visiting sovereigns and their ministers tried to engage in diplomatic negotiations, hoping for legal and military guarantees to secure their country's integrity in a world dominated by the expanding European powers. A world in which the few countries outside of Europe that remained nominally independent faced the threat of European imperialism. Of course, these deals, brokered in Europe, could make their states even more dependent on the European powers. So it was kind of like a delicate political situation they were in. And yet there was another aspect of these visits that made them even more significant to the guests, and that was the ceremonial splendor of a state visit. A formal reception in a European metropolis offered non-European rulers the opportunity to present themselves on the same level as European monarchs. Their participations in the rituals and the ceremonials of a state visit gave expression to the monarch's dynastic legitimacy and their country's sovereignty. To a certain extent, the ceremonial aspects of the visits could so symbolically equalize, level, asymmetric power relations. So state visits offered in a way non-European rulers a way of integrating themselves into a system of international relations that was dominated by the European powers. In order to enter the system, though, it was essential for the non-European monarchs to interact within the same social framework of the European courts, taking into account codes of conduct and courtly etiquette in Europe. So the guests had to acculturate to courtly manners that resulted, in parts at least, from a very specific European development, the civilizing process, the Prozess der Zivilisation, as described by Norbert Elias in the case of France, famously in early modern France. So basically, he was looking mainly at the control of bodily functions in the courtly sphere and how they came about. So when did you stop blowing your nose into the curtains and things like that? So there was this very specific European court etiquette. And to gain recognition, the staging of the visit had to meet the perceived European standard, and that was, in the eyes of the dominant European powers, the standard of civilization. Meeting this very standard seemed to be a key condition of becoming accepted as a legitimate and sovereign member in the global community of states and courts. So we should perhaps also obviously, remember that notions of civilization, political legitimacy, and territorial sovereignty were closely connected in most contemporary European legal theories. So in fact, statesmen, diplomats, legal experts routinely distinguish between different stages of civilization when dealing with the European countries. And usually the world was divided into three parts. they were the civilized, the European countries, the half-civilized, which you can see here, and then the uncivilized, who could be colonized. But as the concept of civilization itself was not very clearly defined, European policy towards non-European states did not follow clear lines, but was often ad hoc and pragmatic. And yet, although unpredictable, this international system left some room for action on part of the few independent non-European sovereigns. And the numerous and extensive European tours undertaken by them, and in our case, the Shahs, helped them to demonstrate sovereignty and to consolidate Persia's global position. I mean, Persia was very much on the margins of the international order, and you can see that very well here in this map of Europe, where Persia is still part of it, but basically just as a small lamenting man in the corner, looking at Russia, and Russia looks hungry, obviously, but still part of the map. Let me say a few words about the diplomatic history of the visits. I'll not bore you too much with boring diplomatic history, but I think I should just give you briefly the context. When he left Tehran for his first trip to Europe, Nasreddin was 42 years old. In Iran, he theoretically at least possessed almost absolute authority, although of course his reign was continually threatened by court rivalries, upheavals in the borderlands of Iran, and also obviously opponents like segments of the ulama, which actually for most part opposed his journey to Europe. And to prevent the palace revolt, the Shah took along with him nearly his whole government, including many potentially hostile functionaries. In its foreign relations, the Qajar court faced an increasing imperial threat from the Tsarist Empire, which, as it expanded into the Caucasus and Central Asia, threatened northern Persia, and also from Great Britain, for which Persia was obviously a buffer state in defense of the Raj. We should also remember that Persia had suffered major military defeats against Russia in 1813 and then 1828, and also against Britain in 1857. So earlier that century, which made Qajar elites very aware of their country's vulnerability and the political significance of the West. So Europe wouldn't have been on the map to the same extent, let's say in the 18th century or earlier. So it was this particular moment in time where those visits suddenly became conceivable, thinkable, conceptualizable. In Europe, the Persian sovereigns then engaged in various political negotiations in the hope for guarantees and treatises affirming Persian independence. In the beginning, it was relatively easy for the Shahs to receive invitations to the European courts because the Europeans also had some interest. So, for example, in 1873, the newly founded German Reich, for instance, could also benefit both internally and externally from promoting itself on the world stage by receiving foreign monarchs. The same is true for the Tsarist Empire, where the court always was kind of like eager to present Russia on the global stage as a great power, perhaps even a Western power. British officials were keen to receive the Shahs as they were anxious that he would otherwise come under Russian influence. And in 1873, Queen Victoria actually came down from Balmoral for the visit, even though she had largely withdrawn from public activity after the death of Prince Albert in 1861. So this was a significant event also for the British court. Over the years, the political gains secured by the Shahs during the visits shrank because as rivalry between the imperial powers in Europe increased, most of the European states became more and more reluctant to sign treaties of friendship and to gain guarantees, especially countries like Germany, Austria-Hungary, France, Belgium, and so on. So Persia more and more is part of the Anglo-Russian sphere of influence, and this disinterest was kind of portrayed once here in this drawing showing basically Wilhelm II turning his back to Nasreddin Shah in 1889, symbolizing his interest. And it's perhaps not a coincidence that the Shah is also portrayed, basically depicted on the same side as the women and the children, but maybe I'm over-interpreting here. Anyway, finally, the Persian constitutional revolution, which broke out in 1905, late 1905, among other reasons, also over the collection of taxes to repay Russian loans for the Shah's last royal tour, made further travel impossible. So now let me come to the second and perhaps more important part of this paper. An important role why the Persians were so eager to be received in Europe was the visit's mere symbolic meaning. The ceremonies employed for the Shahs during their visits did in fact not differ much from those usually provided for European royalty. And still in 1873, no one in Europe had much experience with receiving an Oriental ruler, as it was often put. And in fact, officials in all of the European capitals looked to Russia, where the Shah was first received, and then decided to copy the ceremony from St. Petersburg. Even more important here was that the Europeans were willing to rank the Shah's royal status above their ethnic origin, or basically the foreignness and the remoteness of the geographical remoteness of the country they represented. David Kennedy once called this crown above color. So the Europeans kind of had a long tradition, which famously had been studied by Ernst Kantorowicz, distinguishing between the monarch's physical and symbolic body, right? The king's two bodies. And the physical body in this respect, the weaker body, in the Shah's case, became less significant. And it was a symbolic body as a monarch that really counted in Europe. And moreover, there was also this sort of solidarity among monarchs that remained relatively strong, especially after the Congress of Vienna in the 19th century, a phenomenon that has been described as royal cosmopolitanism or fraternity of monarchs. And the Shahs benefited from these European conceptions, despite the weakness and the foreignness of the country they represented. During the visits, the Shahs were provided, as a consequence, with modern means of transport, like trains and steamships, demonstrating their authority in the world of modernity, and they were accommodated in palaces and grand houses. The main streets of Europe's capitals were usually decorated with the Persian national colors, the hoisting of the Persian flag, symbolizing the monarch's authority and Persia's sovereignty. Also, the Persia insignia of the lion and the sun became part of the ceremonial iconography. So this all helped basically to the Qajar court to stage Persia on the global stage. And there's several visual representations of these entries of the monarchs in Europe, into European capitals here in, well, not a couple in this case, Moscow in 73, Berlin with sitting next to Crown Prince Frederick in 73. The Shah also depicted a bit darker, maybe, complexion than he actually was. Then obviously the grandest entry along the Champs-Élysées here at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. Here's the entry in London, and then in 1889 coming basically down the Thames, disembarking at Westminster. The Shahs, for their part, performed the ritualized European choreography of a state visit almost perfectly. Why is that? Well, first, they had no problems coping with aristocratic practices, which resembled those of the Qajar court. In fact, Europeans and Persians shared much ceremonial ground. So among the common customs, the shared customs were, for example, hunting, very common both in Persia and in the European courtly sphere. Military parades, another element, also shared. And the exchange of decorations. I mean, hunting is just like, one example here in Luxembourg Palace, but there are also many representations of the Shahs attending military reviews in Europe. And in Persia, there could be thousands of troops who were involved in public military reviews at the time. So very significant and something the Shahs didn't really have to adapt to, but shared, basically. It's common ceremonial ground. Same true for gifts and decorations, also both important at the Qajar court. In fact, the Persians carried boxes of medals with them to Europe, and the most popular Persian decoration, the Order of the Lion and the Sun, had already been founded by Fath Ali Shah in 1808, initially with the intention of honoring foreign officials. Nasreddin then had also founded the Order of the Imperial Effigy, which he gave only to Europe's sovereigns. Here you can see the Order of the Lion and the Sun, obviously. There were 5 classes towards the end under Nasreddin Shah. And Nasreddin also founded the Order of the Sun for ladies, just on the eve of his first European tour to be able to honor European court ladies. And Nasreddin in return received the Belgian Order of Leopold, the German Black Eagle Medal, and even the Order of the Garter. When Muzaffareddin visited England in the summer of 1902 and was only offered the portrait of King Egbert set in diamonds, instead of the Order of the Garter, he refused and, deeply upset, left England. And in fact, the episode led then to serious tensions in Anglo-Iranian relations, and eventually a special delegation had to be sent to Tehran to give the Shah the order. And Vanity Fair famously portrayed this, made fun of this, showing Muzaffareddin basically proudly wearing the blue ribbon of the Garter. So all of these practices were shared by European and non-European monarchs. It would therefore be misleading to characterize them as intercultural royal visits or cross-cultural or transcultural visits, as this would be to assume that the monarchs were separated by 2 different cultures. In fact, we should be cautious to understand all relations between European and non-European monarchs in terms of a simple adaptation to or rejection of a seemingly fixed European standard. Throughout the modern period, royal practices had converged around the globe, and so there was this shared status-based, class-based repertoire of symbolic actions and meanings they could draw on in these encounters. And yet other parts of the European ceremonial provided for the Shahs proved to be more difficult. They were not accustomed to sitting through long royal banquets, ballets, balls, operas, listening to music alien to their ears. And yet the Shahs proved a remarkable willingness to adapt to European customs here as well. So, for example, they proved their ability to meet European standards in the ritual of the handshake, which was unfamiliar to them. And in England, they would even perform the gesture of hand kissing when meeting Queen Victoria, as you can see here on the right, during his 1889 visit. In his diaries, he frequently explained these greeting rituals as tarof, interestingly, so kind of like legitimized them as a kind of pure gesture of politeness, rather than maybe profound, a meaning with more profound significance, political significance. A more difficult obstacle were table rituals. 3 months before his first visit to Europe, Nasreddin, who was accustomed to eating with his hands, learned how to eat with European cutlery. At Europe's courts, both Shahs even adjusted to the ritual of toasts, raising their glasses to kings, queens, and empresses. And this was not easy for them, and they write about this in detail in their travelogues, how they copied, imitated their European counterparts, but frequently struggled. And finally, obviously, also the presence of ladies at official events caused difficulties. In contrast to the homosocial, gender-segregated milieu of the Qajar court, in Europe, noble women took part in most courtly activities. So male-female intimacy in the courtly sphere, such as a man leading a woman by the arm or public dancing at balls, habitually even with another man's wife, was new to Qajar nobles. Differences obviously were most explicitly exemplified in the physical appearance of court ladies, the public display of the female body in low-cut ball gowns, all described in detail in Nasreddin's diaries. And for the Europeans, this was also something, obviously, in an Orientalist manner, in a way, to portray in these kind of like visual depictions. So there are many pictures showing these encounters between the Shahs, the Persians, and European ladies at court. In his travelogues, interestingly, Nasreddin often made very unflattering remarks about the aristocratic ladies of Europe. There are many examples of Bismarck's wife, Johanna von Puttkammer, for example. He noted, I quote, "Bismarck's wife is very, very, very ugly. Poor Bismarck," end quote. Though he later put her into perspective, I quote again, "They introduced General Boyen's wife to me. Thousands of blessings upon Bismarck's wife. Amazing how ugly she was. Poor Boyen. His daughter was also very ugly," end quote. And I could go on and on here. There are many, many similar quotations. And I was struggling with this for a while and initially thought, well, maybe it was just the power imbalance, the relatively powerful, more dominant role of women at court in Europe that kind of troubled the Shahs. And that is definitely one factor, I think. But apart from this relatively powerful position of European noblewomen in court life, Nasreddin was particularly disgusted by the ideal of beauty. In his diary, he continuously commented on the artificial, even non-existent eyebrows of European noblewomen, the white powder that covered their faces, and so on. And some of you will know Afsane Nachavati's Women with Mustaches and Men Without Beards on sexual aesthetics and sexuality more generally in 19th century Iran. And when we read this together, we realize that, in fact, all these beauty standards in Europe, the powder, the white faces, the artificial thin eyebrows, and so on, contrasted very unfavorably with the Qajar ideal of the thick monobrow, the Frida Kahlo thing they had over their eyes, or the rose-faced woman, the rosy cheeks, kind of natural cheeks, or even the visible down of moustache. So all these factors basically contributed to Nasreddin's negative portrayal of women. And here you can obviously see the Qajar ideal of beauty, monobrow, rosy cheeks, and so on. No white powder or anything. Well, you know the pictures, the photographs of Nasreddin's harem, where you basically have a very different kind of like beauty standard represented there. And yet, despite all of these problems, both Shahs learned very quickly how to cope with unfamiliar gender roles and how to interact appropriately with European ladies at court, both regularly, even escorted queens and empresses by the arm. So what was the reason for this adaptation to European standards? Well, the Shah's adequate performance in Europe was not entirely uninterested. It was, in fact, in their own political interest to fit in. And although the very adaptation to European etiquette implied recognition of European hegemony, these proper receptions at courts across Europe helped them to promote the image of their country on the international stage, and they were very aware of this and also reflected about this or on this in their diaries. And yet these royal visits, and I will come to the end here, were not without risk for the Shahs, since they could also expose cultural differences. In some cases, the Shahs simply could not cope with European customs. Indeed, the list of anecdotes of the Shah's improper behavior at court is long. Most amusing to the European observers was the Persians' reluctance to remove the fur caps, the collar, during formal dinners, whereas according to European custom, one had to remove one's headgear and keep one's shoes on when entering a room. Qajar etiquette dictated the opposite, basically, right? You kept your head on and took your shoes off. More problematic, the Shah's lack of French, the lingua franca, still, even at the late 19th century at European courts and also of European diplomacy, was a problem. Both Nasreddin and Muzaffareddin could understand some French, but were unable to speak it. What Muzaffareddin occasionally said, très magnifique, très bon, at intervals without any particular reason. And this language barrier was a real burden to the Shahs, making their visit appear unusual in the European context. But in other cases, the Europeans too made some changes to the usual ceremonial. Parts of the decorations provided for the Shahs articulated stereotypical patterns of an Oriental taste, which were mostly the creation of the European imagination and had little to do with Iranian reality. So palms, Persian carpets, colorful pillows, and so on were arranged. In Berlin, in 1889, a Persian marquee was built at the train station to welcome the Shah. In London that year, a gigantic Oriental papier-mâché palace was constructed on the facades of some of the houses on the road to the Guildhall the Shah passed by. Also look at the Shah's itineraries in Berlin shows that the visits to the theater were special as they were only shown place on Oriental themes, like the ballets Aladdin or Vincenzo Bellini's ballet The Buccaneer, all basically set in the Orient, articulating Orientalist stereotypes. And usually the Shahs presented with these odd spectacles couldn't quite understand what the hosts were intending to signal. And at times they were describing these things like the tent in Berlin, Nasreddin described as a dervish tent. Orientalist art he would usually describe as North African, Maghrebi or Arab. But he would never really identify himself with these Orientalist spectacles. So in the end, because of this lack of adaptation in parts of the Shahs, and also because of the Orientalization of the spectacle by the Europeans, the visit undermined the Iranians' wish to be accepted as equals on the world stage. So let me conclude. The Shah's visit to Europe played a central role in I have another Orientalist picture here, played a central role in the Shah's struggle for international prestige and recognition. And yet the question whether these attempts on the whole were successful or not is not easy to answer. Although the tours may have overall succeeded in affirming formal self-determination and sovereignty, they also made Persia militarily, economically, and politically more dependent than ever before, and eventually even caused domestic unrest. Thank you. It was a real pleasure to present today, and I'm sorry again for not being there in person. The book on the Shahs will actually be out relatively soon, hopefully within the next year. So it's a great opportunity now to present some of the findings here. Have a great conference. See you soon.
Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, who probably doesn't need much of an introduction to many of us in this room, Professor Charles Melville, Professor Emeritus of Persian History at the University of Cambridge and a Fellow of Pembroke College, Cambridge. He was the President of the British Institute of Persian Studies from 2017 to 2023, and is also the Director of the Shahnameh Project, based at Pembroke in Cambridge as well. He's the author of numerous books and articles, and sorry? Not so many. Edited volumes, yeah. Edited volumes, including the being the editor of the 3 most recent volumes that grew out of the conferences, these conferences, the Idea of Iran conferences. He is also editor of A Short History of the Gibb Memorial Trust and its trustees, and is currently researching the visualization of Persian history with a Leverhulme Emeritus Fellowship. Today he's going to be speaking on communications and the circulation of news in 19th century Iran.
Well, thank you very much, Asif, for that, and for Fatima also for entrusting me with carrying on organising these conferences with the support of SOAS. This is rather a work in progress. I know everyone always says that, but when I stupidly abused my privilege as organising these things to speak twice, which is not the given rule, I did give a paper on the Mongol period some time ago. I thought that I had quite a lot of interesting material that was still sitting in the vault, as it were, and this was a good moment to bring it out. And of course, when I discovered that the vault was rather firmly closed, and it was going to be quite a job digging it out, I started rather late in putting this together. But nevertheless, I thought it would be worth trying to pull together various strands of things that are usually dealt with rather more separately. And this is to do with the question of communications and the circulation of news, which is essentially another look at sources. I'm interested in historiography generally. And even in the medieval period, you might ask the question, somebody sitting in Isfahan reports news of something, it could be anything really, that happened in Mashhad, say. Well, how does he know what happened in Mashhad? How long did it take the news to get there? What, even if you're living in Mashhad, how did you know what happened in Mashhad the previous week? I mean, how do we know what's going on in London now? It's not, you know, we all rely on written sources, but how do we know the origin of the material we're looking at? So I think this is a perennial question which applies to any historical investigation of any country or period. But it seems to me it's particularly interesting in the Qajar period, where we are now, because there's an explosion of information, just as there's an explosion of information that we have learned about the Qajar. I say we, I mean, you know, as a frightful imperialists in the 19th century. News of Iran becomes far more prevalent and far better circulated. And anyway, so there are various things happening more or less at the same time that I think makes this particularly the case in the Qajar era. But well, my starting point, as often actually in some of my other work, is to see how one can apply topics of research in the field of European history to the case of Iran. For instance, the idea of an itinerant monarchy, which I've written about a bit. And as we just heard from David Muhtadil, in the last quarter of the 19th century, the Persian Shahs travelled extensively, both within Iran and abroad, and documented their journeys in considerable descriptive and chronological detail. So I'm not going to talk about the journeys abroad at all, because not only have we heard about them, but the point I want to discuss more is the circulation of news about Iran within Iran. Okay. So the Shahs were travelling partly on for military reasons, but also for relaxation. And we mentioned some of their travels again a little bit later. But they were itinerating, for instance, between summer and winter pastures, just like their Mongol and even Seljuk predecessors, either to Sultaniye or Firuz Kuh, the Judge Rood and the Lower Valley, as is well known and frequently documented. One of Nasruddin Shah's earliest travelogues concerned his trip to Khorasan in 1867, and his journeys in general established a model for travel writing, as it of course is well known. He wrote in a very simple style, like the women in Europe. He didn't doll it up with a whole lot of Arabic sage. And this obviously stimulated a great amount of travel literature and travelogues within Iran itself, and people travelling, especially courtiers, of course, on government or other business. So the starting point then, as I say, is the question of the circulation of news. And there was a stimulating conference published 30 years ago, I'm afraid to say, on the proceedings on the topic of la circulation des nouvelles au Moyen Âge. This opened with a consideration of the vast network of papal communications established by Pope Gregory XI at Avignon, 1370 to 1378, but also the comparable needs of rulers, merchants and bankers for rapid communications. Well, of course, there's a substantial difference between 14th and 15th century Europe and 19th century Iran, but the similarities are greater between both at that time than comparisons between them would be in the 19th century. Besides differences of terrain and political and bureaucratic development, the essential issues remain the same: the organisation of a relay system and couriers, and the question of the speed of travel. Because it seems to me that speed is an essential for news. There's no point hearing about something that happened 3 months ago. Really, I mean, it depends. The importance of the information partly reflects how quickly it arrives. So Iran, of course, had a long experience of such systems, from the Achaemenids Royal Road to the implementation of the official Mongol network, the Yarm, and its establishment of relay stations. This seems to have fallen into disuse in the Safavid period and was entirely broken down by the end of the 18th century, despite the continuation of the dispatch of riders on official business and foot messengers, charter, for official and more general purpose. So obviously people are still sending around messengers, but the point is, were the relay stations to assist the spread of news and the availability of horses at regular intervals and so on like this. So, as I say, I'm going to pull together 3 or 4 different topics, which all connect to the same point, essentially. So the first one is the Chaparkhane, the post houses, as opposed to just people running around on their horses. So according to a detailed study by Willem Floor, the use of relay stations continued informally early in the reign of Fath Ali Shah, but was not revived on a systematic basis as a formal postal service until the time of Nasr ad-Din Shah in 1850-51, with the orders to rebuild and maintain a new network of Chaparkhane on the initiative of the Amir Kabir. Floor provides itineraries and approximate distances and sometimes times for 9 of the most travelled routes with Chaparkhanes. I don't know if you can see that, it's just distilled from his article, based on the appendices in a chap called Holmes, who was writing in 1845. There are hundreds of others, of course, that's one of the problems. Well, I mean, there are thousands, actually, of itineraries and different estimates of the times and the distances between the stations and so on. But anyway, they were built at intervals of between 3 and 6 farsakhs, which we can take as roughly 12 to 24 miles, which is the same in Europe, and is obviously dependent partly on how quickly and for how long horses can keep going. Riders could cover roughly 70 or 100 miles a day, which is roughly the same time as we know express messengers were operating in the time of Shah Abbas. Numerous descriptions of these routes and distances and times taken are available from different periods, one of which, for example, by a chap called Robert John Kennedy on the route from Tehran to Mashhad using the Chapar relays, records 24 stations, 24 stages with stations every 16 to 30 miles. So quite a big interval, obviously, depending on terrain. He measured the journey as 542 miles, which his small party covered in 14 days, averaging therefore 38 miles a day. Well, we all know the farsakh is a movable feast, and it's difficult to convert this into miles and kilometres at any particular time. The British travellers tend to use either farsakhs or miles, and they tend to measure it, but they're obviously all measuring it differently. So that's the route Tehran to Mashhad, which is clearly one of the most important ones. And the other major route is the southern route from Tehran down to Bushehr, for reasons that become obvious. When I was doing some early work on earthquakes, one of the things we did, which is one of the reasons I thought I had all this fabulous body of information, was hundreds and hundreds of travelogues marking their routes on a map. Hundreds of maps, in other words, one for each. And it's quite clear that the main routes were north-south, Tehran to the Persian Gulf, what we call the A1 in those days, and then also Tehran to Khorasan and In other words, a route across the north of the country and one route down. I mean, it's obvious, but still you can document this very clearly. C.J. Wills, who was in Persia on and off between 1866 and 1881, estimates the journey between Tehran and Bushehr following the postal stations as 205.5 farsakhs in 38 stages. But as I said, there are many other views of this. So I'm only mentioning these details, which of course could be taken as slightly tedious, to show that there was a system and it could go at various speeds, but it was an organised way of transferring news and information across the main arteries of the country. Well, the rate of travel for non-urgent journeys using the system varied greatly, depending, of course, on the reasons for travel. I think it's important, as I mentioned, to say why we need to know the speed, because the reliability and speed of communications affect not only the reach and efficiency of government control, but also implies how urgent or significant the news might be considered for both the sender and the recipient. Daily records clearly carry more urgency and are less filtered than fortnightly or even weekly reports. I mean, do you actually bother to send something if it's looking back on a whole week or more? Well, travel is frequently mentioned. The hospitality received by the officials of the telegraph companies, both British and Persian, especially when alternative comforts and accommodation in the chapar-khanes or caravanserais, which frequently followed the same routes, were either lacking or unpalatable. And if we want one way of collecting an idea of Iran is the comments of these Europeans, particularly travelling around, and the appalling accommodations they encountered on the way. But they were still pretty intrepid, actually, I must say. It's amazing how they put up with what most of us wouldn't even dream of doing, even when we were students, hitchhiking. Wills himself was a medical doctor serving in the British government telegraph department. So that's the chapar-khane. Okay, this is one plank of this. It started around 1850s, the organisation of new relay posts and the building of them. Some of them are reported as being new and some are dilapidated and so on. But this is one plank of the communications network. The telegraph, the second one, not long after the revival of the chapar relay network, the use of electric telegraph was initiated, first with the encouragement of Malcolm Khan, and connections were made with Sultaniye, the Shah's summer encampment, first, and then on to Tabriz in 1858 to 1860, with the help of technical assistance from the Dar al-Funun people. This was later updated and extended when in 1868 the Shah gave Siemens, a private company, a contract to continue the line to the Russian border, whence it eventually continued to London under Russian control. The increased traffic to Tehran via this company, this private company, spurred growth on the system for the rest of Iran to accommodate traffic onwards from Iran to India. And this was the establishment of the Indo-European Telegraph Department as opposed to the company. In 1863, the British, alarmed by the Indian Mutiny of 1857 and the need for rapid communications, negotiated the establishment of the Indo-European Telegraph Department as a branch of the government of India. I mean, this is all well known. As I say, I'm just trying to put these building blocks together. Direct communications with London across Iran from Khani Keen in Iraq to Bushehr and thence onward by submarine cable through the Persian Gulf via Gwadar started in 1865, so not long after the establishment of the chapar-khane network. Thereafter it expanded considerably in the north to Rasht, 1869, Astrabad, 1870, Mashhad, 1876, and in the south to Kirman in 1879. This is a map I produced years ago, frighteningly long ago, to show the network of information coming in on, I was looking at earthquakes at the time, but also other natural disasters. Of course, one of the things that are quite frequently reported. Once the telegraph network was established, the speeds of communication were naturally extremely rapid, the commencement of the company system set up by Siemens shortened Indo-European communications from 12 days to 6 minutes. So it's quite sort of quantum jump that the later car and the internet has produced now. This depended, however, on the maintenance and functionality of the lines. For the present purposes, communications within Iran, it may be necessary to distinguish the Government of India's official line, the department line between India and London, and the Persian government lines, which were established in parallel and apparently used or able to be used by both. This is a slightly murky area. I haven't completely distinguished which lines were which. The distinction is not always clear, and the running of the lines was transferred sometimes from one authority to another. Various reports, however, record the considerable intervals when the network was not functioning. So if you want to know when information is coming, you need to know actually if the telegraph line was working at that period or not. It all goes down to the availability of news, and of course there's no news if there's no way of communicating it. In 1879, Preece noted that the Tehran-Mashhad line, which had been opened only 3 years earlier, was so bad that it was often down and generally was open only 2 days a week, and the other lines were no better. In 1891, Biddulph, a well-known traveller, described the deplorable state of the line between Rasht and Qazvin, and the line up to Enzeli also, incidentally, was an important one, obviously. The lines running on poles that sometimes had insulators and sometimes not, and often just stretching between the branches of the trees going through the jungle. In other words, no proper system. Incidentally, there's a beautiful story which I read once and haven't been able to find since, that the line running down the southern line was impeded by the fact that the Bakhtiari tribesmen were going along shooting bang, 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 the insulator caps on the wires. If anyone knows where, I might have read that reference. Quite good to find it again. So it was like this marksmanship going down the line, knocking out all the insulator caps on the lines. In 1895, the lines from Mashhad were interrupted to Kalat, 104 days, with Qajar 133 days, with Sarax 112 days, with Bujnur 356 days, and with Daragez 361. In other words, that line was only working 4 days in the year. In comparison, this smug British-operated line from Tehran to Mashhad was only down 10.5 days in the first 9 months of the year. We're talking about 1895, of which 3 days were due to the absence of the operator, so it's a bit like British Rail. In 1899, there was some improvement of Mashhad Kalat down was 21 days out of action. Kalat Daragez 80 days, and Mashhad Sarax 62 days. So, but nevertheless, these are significant intervals when the lines were not active. And so, as in the case of the so-called postal network, the question is significant regarding the question of how quickly and, of course, how regularly news might be dispatched and received, as well as regarding which destinations were connected and how extensive was the coverage. This map goes way up into the early 20th century, so it's not typical of what's actually in the period I'm focusing on, which is the first sort of 30 years of Nasruddin Shah's reign, before the political troubles started, because that produced an enormous further increase in information and also in the type of information that was being communicated. Well, so this becomes relevant when one considers the establishment of the newspaper press in Iran and the extent to which the telegraph network became an important source of news and therefore its subsequent circulation. So this is the third plank of my scaffolding. So on the newspapers, as recorded by E.G. Brown and many others, the first Persian newspaper was Ruzname Vaqai Ittifaqiyeh, established in February 1851, and continued with a change of name to 1860 as the Ruzname Dowlati-e Iran, the supplying government. A decade later, with a merger of 3 separate titles, it continued as Ruzname Iran from 1271. So we have the first one, 51 to 60, 60 to 71, and then Ruzname Iran, starting on the 2nd of April 1871, which actually continued way up into the 20th century. This was under the auspices of the new press department, later a ministry, headed by Mohammed Hassan Khan, Sania Doule, later Itimad Sultana, whose role, of course, was very important in all these developments. He was the press minister of Nasruddin Shah, ultimately. I might leave out what they say. Except to just say there was a mixture of foreign news. It was largely court news, quite a lot of foreign news, quite a lot of translations of European material, travel books and other things. I found even one of them the other day was travelling, the translation of Stout Cortez's travels in Mexico in the early 16th century. So I mean there was a terrific aim to open up the outside world, excuse me, in its literature. And it's interesting to notice that, although I haven't looked systematically, news by telegraph was received as in the papers as early as 1865. So right from the beginning, really, of the news of the telegraph network being established, telegraphic news was being recorded in the newspapers. In this case, from Azerbaijan, which, as I mentioned, was one of the first lines to be connected anyway. So to sum up, I haven't finished, don't worry. To sum up, at this point, starting with the first decade of the reign of Nasruddin Shah, three more or less interrelated institutions were established that contributed to the production and circulation of news. The relay system, the Chapakhanes, the telegraph network, and the Persian press. And all these combined to provide sources of information for a local audience. As these were almost all government-sponsored operations, the main audience was government officials who were obliged to purchase them, but also the court elite and presumably merchants and others. And despite barely 5% literacy, even in the cities, it seems that the papers could be read out in villages and towns across the country. I'll cut out what that meant for the Europeans. But just to say, as I mentioned, the Iranians themselves start to record their travels. Not a very recent count, actually now, 10 years ago. Over 280 travel counts were noted, over half in the reign of Nasruddin Shah, partly inspired by his example. Around about 75 of these, or nearly 40%, concern travels within Iran. Tracing these in bibliographical sources highlights, that's to say, bibliographies as well as manuscript catalogues, highlights an important point, I think, a blurring of genre and categorization between memoirs, which you might call khatirat, or tazkireh, even a mention, a memorial of a journey, and travelogues, or safarnameh. So these different types of book all actually tended to contain much of the same sort of information. It highlights these different genres and the extent to which this information penetrated into mainstream historiography and the production of court chronicles. So that's my fourth plank. This can be demonstrated very briefly by the way the Qajar Shah's travels are reported and later recorded in considerable detail. I'll leave out this bit. It's clear, comparing, for instance, the quite well documented journeys of Fath Ali Shah, which just say he went there and he came back then. Nasruddin Shah's travelogues, the decision not just to travel so much, but also to record his journeys, makes it clear how he saw them as a means to promote an image of himself. So we're not talking about his image in Iran, in Europe now, an image of himself as an effective and committed presence throughout the protected realms, the extent and knowledge of which he was anxious to proclaim, which Magme Sohrabis wrote a very nice article about this, the three aspects of legitimacy, diplomacy and knowledge production, and specifically geographical knowledge, partly through the media already noticed, the posts and the telegraphs and the papers, but also in the historical literature. notably in the annals of the reign compiled by the Itamada Sultan, who I mentioned, his press chief, Minister of Press from 1883 onwards. So what sort of news are we talking about, briefly? As noted, the emphasis is on court and government business, the change of appointments and the activities of the monarch, with a variety of domestic and foreign news. In the present context, we may note that Nasruddin Shah's journey to Khorasan in April to October 1867 is recorded in detail in a sequence of issues of the paper Ruzname Dowlat-e Iran, and chronicled in similar extensive details with the exact itinerary in Semir Dowlat's Montazam-i Nasri, which is a sort of chronicle in a way. I mean, it's not really a proper historical narrative, but it's an analytic record of the reign. And the same can be said of the Shah's journey to Gilan from October 1867 to March 1870, reported in the paper almost as it happened. It's worth noting the Shah was away a long time. I mean, October 1867 to March 1870, just in Gilan. It's not just journeys. This is a ruler who is going around the country, staying there, dealing with local officials, not unlike Shah Abbas, actually. Which is it's another aspect of this. It's not so much relevant to the question of communication, but I think the peripatetic monarchy has not been actually sufficiently emphasized in talking about the Qajar court. And then his important journey to the Atabat in Ottoman Iraq the same year he was away from September 1870 until February 1871, recorded serially and immediately in the newspaper, and then later in the Shah's own travelogue. So we're seeing a production of information that puts the Shah, that's good, I may finish, puts the Shah in the same sort of level of activity and self-imaging that we saw in David's paper on the Shah in Europe. It's the same idea, but he's not just doing it in Europe, he's doing it in Iran as well. And therefore people in Iran are seeing the Shah and seeing that he's travelling around, he's dealing with the local officials, and of course this is a way of establishing control partly, but also finding out about the territory that he's ruler of, which of course unfortunately is a shrinking territory. So I've now got some jolly pictures, not very good ones, to illustrate some of the newspapers. A further dimension to the news is given by illustrations when it comes to providing an idea that one could see as well as read about. So there's a rare, rather flaky image in the Dowlat-e Iran depicting the Shah's. I think there are probably better copies of this sort of thing all over the place, but in Jajrud in 1866, he was there frequently. Again, this is the whole idea of summer and winter quarters alternation, getting out of the stuffy capital in Tehran into the mountain valleys. A newspaper, there were very few illustrations in this paper, but a later publication, the newspaper, so-called newspaper Sharaf, it's a periodical every month, provides regular images of the Shah's activities alongside official portraits of leading courtiers, including a hunt. I quite like this one because the paper has the account of the hunt, but actually those of you blessed with good eye, here is the Shah shooting a tiger that's running away. So this is a nice illustration. Well, you can see it in the Sharaf newspaper. It's got the details of the day. So this is a monthly thing. So this is an example. So this is the sort of news people might want to read. The Shah sets off for Mashhad in June 1883. That's a pretty heroic picture. You know, he's not just sitting there at home behind his desk. He's off for quite a long trip. Construction of the Masjid-i-Nasiri in Tehran. Is this the? This is sorry. Yes, this is a description of the thing. So this is in the newspaper. This is the detailed itinerary of his journey to Mashhad and back, which is also documented in his own travel. So there's no escaping it. In other words, it's one thing writing a book that no one's going to read, but it's in the newspapers as well. And then this is the construction of the work on the Masjid-i-Nasiri. I'm not sure which mosque this is. I mean, I didn't have time to... Is it the Sabah Salah? Do you know, Fatima, the Masjid-i-Nasiri? I don't know which one. Do you know which one is? Anyway, it's in Tehran, so it's probably got a new name now. As well as, this is the coup de grace, pictures of Queen Victoria, the Eiffel Tower, reflecting the Shah's European travels. So in other words, the newspapers are a way of helping people, illustrated newspapers, a way of people actually seeing things they might read about, but they'd never actually go and see themselves. It makes it obviously far more immediate. I'm going to cut out the conclusions, because I think they're fairly obvious in a way, and said basically why this is all interesting. There's one aspect that I didn't have time to cover, and I'm not quite sure how to do so, so I'm inviting your help. One of the Paris conference I mentioned actually was in Avignon years ago about the circulation des nouvelles, addressed the question of rumour rather than just, you know, news circulating by rumour rather than by official publications. So far I've only found one article just by Googling Charrier in Persian on the internet, and I found a very interesting article by a lady called Zahra Cheragi. It's quite old, 2011. And she discusses, I only read it very, very briefly, clearly rumours circulating various events. One is the murder of Grigoriev, you know, the Russian ambassador in Tehran. One is the death of Amir Kabir. One is the banning on smoking, in other words, the start of the tobacco thing. One on the death of Nasruddin Shah. And then the Darcy concession. And I think what she's getting at is that there's the official account of these things, but what people were thinking about isn't how news travel. And I don't know how one would measure that, actually, almost by definition. But I think if you... I know there are all these khasirat and memoirs, and if people start writing, "It is said that," or "I heard that," or "in the bazaar they're saying this," this would be a way of trying to document this sort of second level of the circulation of news, which I think would be a topic. Maybe someone's already done something about it, but this would be something I would like to see more about myself. And then finally, on the question of the rumour, the only thing I saw just by chance reading through Wills's book about Persia recently, apparently when he was travelling to Isfahan in July 1877, he was at Yazdi-Khast, and he just notes, I quote, "People here report the king's death and there is a great panic." Well, I think it's a good way to end. But the fact is that I don't know what was behind that rumour. Maybe he was ill. Anyway, it's interesting. So thank you very much for your attention.